Good morning, everybody. I'm Marina Mensch. I'm the Assistant to the Director here at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, and this is my colleague Noah.
Hi, I'm Noah Shuela. I am a young research fellow at MIGS this summer and a student at the University of Toronto.
Thank you for joining us today. Perhaps the three of you could introduce yourself a little bit. Perhaps starting with Thierry.
Well, I am Thierry Vircoulon. I'm the Central Africa Director for International Crisis Group based in Nairobi.
Marie-Claude?
So I'm Marie-Claude Dupont. I'm a journalist, documentarist. I work for Radio Canada, and I've been in Burundi for the elections of 2005 and 2010.
Excellent, thank you. Katrin?
Yeah, hello, my name is Katrin Wittig. I'm a PhD student at the University of Montreal, working on conflict resolution and democratization, among other things, in Burundi. And over the last 2 years, I've been conducting research in Burundi.
Thank you very much.
Great. So I will start with just a brief introduction of what's been happening in Burundi, and then I guess we'll get started with questions. So after a brutal civil war, the party that is appointed to power, led by previous rebels during the war, reigns peacefully for 5 years. It's hard to say whether the country's subsequent success was a product of the government's benevolence and successful management, or merely was due to the presence of real and material peace in more than 20 years. The 2010 elections were riddled with fraud, intimidation, and were by no means competitive, with opposition parties stepping down and the incumbent gaining 92% of the vote. 5 years later, the now president, with despotic flair, declares he has no intention of going anywhere. As elections approach, riots break out, coups fail, opposition scatters, media outlets are closed, international support is revoked, and still the elections must go on. The formula of charismatic Democrat turned power-hungry authoritarian is all too familiar in new democracies. 50 years down the road, this may very well be considered the unfortunate ironing out of Burundi's young democratic process, a necessary but painful step. However, for Burundians today, over 300,000 of which considered of concern by the UNHCR, refugees and IDPs, this seems like the unnecessary proceeding of a chapter of hellish few decades of violence and chauvinistic, destructive governance. So helping us make sense of the current reality in Burundi, I guess we'll get started with the questions. So the first question is for Katrin. There's a certain upsetting irony that on the 10th anniversary of the brutal civil war that ushered in an era of democracy, that violence and humanitarian crises emerge out of the overwhelming desire for that democracy. Was the democratic process in Burundi ever meaningfully consolidated after 2005, or was it institutionalized in a sense?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. I just have a quick question. We're not going through the personal introduction that you also suggested?
No, you introduce yourself just in a sentence, so it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I think, indeed, I think the first post-transition elections in 2005 represented a big step towards democracy in Burundi, and I think they were accompanied by a lot of hope for the population that had suffered from a decade-long plus civil war that was triggered by the first democratic presidential elections in 1993 that were followed by the assassination of the first democratically elected Hutu president, Melchior Ndadaye. But after the 2005 elections, Burundi was at the beginning widely praised as a beacon of hope at the time for democratization in Central Africa. But I think already shortly after the 2005 elections, there were signs that the current regime already started to demonstrate authoritarian tendencies which have grown tremendously over the years. And the ruling party was more and more accused of becoming involved in repression of opposition members and corruption scandals. And this dates back actually just shortly after the 2005 elections. We can cite arbitrary arrests of high-ranking opposition members as early as September 2006, and the irregularities surrounding, for example, the selling of presidential jet Falco 50 in 2007. In addition, there were growing accusations of the instrumentalization of parts of the Imbonerakure, which is the movement affiliated to the party that date back, I think, to at least 2007. And so these accusations have become more and more important over the years and are especially worrisome in in how the current crisis unfolds. So I think from the very beginning of the democratization process, there were enormous challenges to consolidate and institutionalize democracy, and these challenges were also exemplified during the 2010 elections. The international community recognized the results, even though they cited certain irregularities. The major opposition parties boycotted the election, citing massive voter fraud. And I think, regrettably for the opposition at the time, this boycott had the unintended effect of paving the way for the CNDD-FDD to further consolidate its power and to become one of the major political forces that controls most of Burundi's political life today. And in the run-up to the 2015 elections, we're witnessing right now with the protests that are going on and with the failed coup attempt, a very tense and unstable situation. The political space has been political opposition parties have systematically been kept from campaigning. Many opposition and civil society leaders have either gone into hiding or have been constrained into exile. And with a lot of independent private radio stations having been shut down and many independent journalists being in hiding or having fled, international election observers having left as well, I think it's hard to imagine how credible elections will be able to take place, even with the delay that has been envisioned by the government.
Right, absolutely. So sort of going off the same idea, I want to return to Marie-Claude and talk about your experience in Burundi monitoring the elections in 2010. So your documentary, Democracy, which sort of traces the electoral process in 2010. I was wondering if you could discuss the recurrent condemnation of by opposition parties in alleging electoral fraud. This is an interesting move because, to a great degree, stepping out of the electoral process sort of removes competition. So I'm wondering, do certain parties that are opposing Nkurunziza feel that they're stuck in a rigged system and it's not worth playing, or might this be a strategic move? I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
I would say that it's both. It began with real irregularities, unsealed ballot boxes, people who were denied to vote by local authorities, overall climate of voter intimidation and bribery, lack of secrecy in the ballot booth, pre-stuffed ballot boxes, power cuts that some people said that it were orchestrated. So, but then the opposition denounced massive fraud by the CNDD-FDD, but between irregularities and massive fraud, there's a gap.
Right.
And no one was able to prove that it was an orchestrated massive fraud. They requested the annulment of the results of the communal elections, the appointment of a new electoral commission, and no one agreed to that. So they decided to withdraw from the electoral process. So I think it's useful to say that the scores obtained by the opposition were far below their own expectations at the time. So it was a shock for them, I think. And they had the conviction that the game had been rigged from the start. And especially they felt that standards for free and fair elections in Burundi were lowered by the fact that the country was emerging from civil war and that the election was seen by the international donors as a major step towards the consolidation of the peace process. So alleging massive fraud in that context was a strategic speculation, and that the boycott would encourage a rerun of the election, which didn't happen.
Thierry, we also have a question for you, more regarding the president's reaction. The EU has cut electoral aid, and the US is sending similar signals. Do you think it will change the president's position? And we know that the elections have already been postponed. But what do you think are the prerequisites before we can actually hold free and fair elections in Burundi?
Well, all the support for all the foreign support for those elections have been suspended. The Dutch, the Belgium, the Swiss they've all announced that they have suspended their financial support for those elections for the reason you've just mentioned. Well, I mean, when the UN Special Envoy for the Great Lakes started the dialogue in Bujumbura, the idea was first to obtain a delay of the electoral calendar, but also to work on the condition, on the politician to be able to have a free and fair election. This is now passed, of course. There's been, I mean, the government has agreed to delay the election, but the problem is that this delay was very much constrained by the idea that if there was no president sworn in August, then there will be a power vacuum. So the delay couldn't be very long, and when the East African community met a few weeks ago, they made clear that the delay was supposed to be not more than 1 month and a half. And that actually did a lot to convince the opposition to get out of the so-called dialogue or mediation. So right now, I mean, nothing is gonna make a free and fair election possible, given the timeline, and the opposition is completely out of the electoral game at this stage.
Right. Thank you.
Great. So our next question again is for Marie-Claude, and if it is true that nothing is going to make free and fair elections possible at this point, again, I wanted to go back to the most recent precedent that we have, the 2010 elections. Does the fact that most, if not all, the opposition leaders went into exile after the election change the dynamic for the current electoral cycle? To what extent can these be considered competitive in any event, even if Western observers have pulled out their support?
You mean in 2010 or?
So
right now.
So the effect. Yeah, the degree.
The effect of the 2010 elections and the boycott. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, since the end of the 2010 elections, opposition have eroded. Of course, opposition, they were not represented in parliament besides UPRONA because they boycotted elections. Most of them were on hiding. Some opposition leaders only came back to Burundi in 2013. Other left. So the opposition had weakened a lot. And I think we are far from beyond saying it is a competitive election or not right now. I mean, there were 2 weeks of electoral campaign. The only parties who campaigned were the ruling party and the UPRONA with satellites party near the government. So during that time, one of the leader of the UPD party from the opposition was assassinated. A journalist was hurt in the attack. So, I mean, of course not. It's not a competitive environment at all. But as everybody has said right now, it's not an environment for an election at all, I think.
Yeah. Katrin, there's obviously a concern for everybody who kind of knows the Great Lakes region. Do you think the president will kind of try to mobilize the ethnic Hutu vote? We know about the Imbonerakure and they're linked to the Interamwe. Where's the threshold here? Do you have real fear about the ethnic dimension, or has it been perhaps over-exaggerated here in Western media? Especially, you know, I've seen titles on CNN when the crisis first started. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's important to. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think first of all it's important to mention that I think the current crisis is not ethical, but it is political.
Yeah, exactly.
Most of the protesters that have been going out on the streets are Hutus, Tutsis, and Twas. They all demonstrate together. So I think the current crisis transcends ethnic divisions, and I think this is very important to highlight. They come from a variety of different opposition parties, a variety of different civil society actors, or they're simple citizens, and they go out together on the streets. But what has been worrying is that there are certain members of the ruling parties that have tried to instrumentalize ethnicity over the last weeks by suggesting that the current protests have mostly been taking place of what they call traditionally Tutsi neighborhoods. But like I said, the movement is very, very inclusive. But this is very worrisome for people. Luckily, this discourse has been harshly criticized by the political opposition, and many Burundians stating that they think these are demons of the past and they have been transcended. But obviously, this gives a lot of hope, but I think the risk of ethnic conflict is there, given the very painful history that Burundi has had. I think that so far, I have actually not heard of any instances where President Nkurunziza himself has overtly used to campaign for the ethnic war. But this could change, and this is definitely something that has to be monitored.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question that I have is for Thierry, and as we mentioned, the number of refugees going out of the country is growing every single day. They're moving into Tanzania, they're moving into Rwanda, and elsewhere. And I guess the question is, how large can the humanitarian crisis sort of become before discussions of holding the election at all becomes totally meaningless? We mentioned that the international support has been pulled away, that right now there's no reason to believe that they're free or fair, but there seems to be a threshold or barrier of oppression and intimidation that Nkurunziza risks crossing at this point.
Well, for the moment, the number of refugees is about 100,000 people. So this is still manageable, and the UN agencies have already done some contingency planning for an increase of the refugees in the region. However, we are waiting to see if there's going to be a new flow of refugees close to the election dates, or maybe after the elections. There's been in recent weeks there's been a slowdown of the number of people leaving the country, and therefore it's very difficult to predict if the figure is going to increase in the coming months. But it's well, I mean, given the figure, this is manageable by the UN agencies and the country and the host countries. But of course, it is a bad memory for Tanzania and and Rwanda, who have in the past also received a lot of Burundian refugees. It's very telling that actually a lot of those refugees who are in Tanzania were before in Tanzania and were repatriated 1 or 2 years ago, but have come back to Tanzania, into Western Tanzania. Firstly, because they know the area, and secondly, because it is some sort of a coping mechanism for them. But at this stage, it's very difficult to say, for instance, if a lot of those refugees are belong to an opposition party or would vote for the opposition. There are speculations that indeed some strongholds of the opposition in the Bururi and Makamba province. A lot of people from those strongholds have actually crossed the border to Tanzania because they were anticipating violence. But the figure so far is manageable by the humanitarian agencies, and it seems that the outbreak of cholera also is more or less under control.
Okay, and do you mind if I just jump in quickly? So, Katrin, I know that you were recently in Burundi. Are you still there at this moment, or?
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to get your quick comment on that. Can you tell that there's what's going on the ground? I'm assuming that you're in Bujumbura, but can you is there interest in holding the elections? Are people protesting against them in general? People that you're discussing with, are people worried that they ought to leave, or what is the sort of sentiment on the ground around this concern?
Well, I think people are very much concerned. Many people here in the capital are concerned that, like we've said, the conditions for credible elections are not met right now. There are many people that have actually left Bujumbura for either the interior or neighboring countries. The protests have been slowing down over the last 1 or 2 weeks, but this is especially due to I think the population, on the one hand, getting tired. Protesters may be getting tired, but especially also due to the intimidation that has been going on. Like Marie-Claude has been mentioning, there have been targeted assassination of opposition leaders. There have been the Imbonerakure that have been reported to do nightly patrols in the neighborhoods to tell people not to go to the streets again. For now, it's been more quiet than it has been at the very beginning, especially before the coup d'etat. So the movement has lost some momentum, but I think this can take off and will take off as we get closer to the election date. And so I think the situation has to be monitored very, very closely.
Marie-Claude, this is for you. Here at MIGS, we really, when the institute was first created, it was really looking at Rwanda and the use of radios in Rwanda to incite violence. So we have a project that monitors newspapers and radios, and as well now as social media in countries at risk, to see signs of violence, perhaps early warning. Perhaps you could, I know you've worked at a radio station in Burundi as a volunteer journalist. Can you perhaps tell us about the role of both government-owned radios, independent radios in Burundi as a communication tool? What kind of role does it play right now, has it played in the past, as well as perhaps do you see how is social media being used now? Because I know the government was trying to shut down social media websites as well.
About social media, I think it's growing since 2010. I can see right now what's going on since the beginning of this crisis. And I mean, Twitter at the time in 2010 was not used at all in Burundi. Nowadays, it's very, very useful for the communication. But I will say more in a broader perspective. I mean, radio and independent and private medias in Burundi have done a tremendous work. I mean, since the end of the war, and before that, since the transition and after the transition, to reconciliation and consolidating peace in the country. They were radio, especially, are used in all the country. Most of all radios, it's a convenient media for a rural population, mostly illiterate. So it was a key. It played a key role in forming masses throughout the country during the transition and after as well. Right now, what we see is since 2010, tension between the ruling party and the independent media have increased drastically. With the withdrawal of main opposition parties during the election, it weakened the opposition voice, and media became the only channel to balance the act and speech of the government beside civil society organization. So independent media became targets since 2010. And some journalists were imprisoned, many were harassed. Rema FM, a new radio created in 2009 and linked to the presidential party, became more aggressive against the opposition and continued to play the ethnic card. The RTNB radicalized. Before, it was more open to a discussion between parties, but then it radicalized and became a media and political tool for the presidency and the ruling party. And with the recent political turmoil surrounding the third-term candidacy of Pierre Nkurunziza, independent media were seriously armed. First, RPA radio, Radio Publique Africaine, was shut down. Radio Isanganiro, Radio Télévision Renaissance, Radio Bonesha were prohibited to broadcast outside the capital. Then, during the protest and the morning of the failed coup d'etat, Rema FM studios were attacked. After the same night, RPA and Radio Télé Renaissance were burned down. The next morning, it was Bonesha in Isanganiro. Some transmitters were destroyed. Material was destroyed too. So many journalists from independent and private media are intimidated right now. They fear for their security. Many of them are on hiding. Only the RTNB and Radio Maria Catholic Radio can broadcast to Burundians living outside the capital, which represent 90% of the population. So it's terrible what is happening actually to media. And yesterday, the Attorney General left the closure ban on the Maison de la Presse studio. Maison de la Presse studio, it's where the Synergie des Médias took place in 2010. It was a fantastic opportunity. All the media get together at the time to give information on the electoral process. They were covering the entire country. And so this left us the ban yesterday. We thought it was paving the way for a possible new Synergie des Médias initiative for these elections. But all the independent media, all the journalists of independent media are prohibited to access the studio except Rema FM journalists. So. And recently, Rema FM was also disseminating the message spread by the presidency that the demonstrations against the third term of Pierre Nkurunziza were led by the Tutsi, an ethnic allegation that was dismissed by the population, dismissed by most opposition parties. So it's bad. It's real bad. And I have to say that there's also a great fear among the population that political violence will remain unreported. Because, you know, some international media are present on the ground, but it's not the same, and they are mostly covering what is happening in Bujumbura and are not necessarily going in rural areas. So, that's the situation right now. So there's a media blackout in Burundi right now, and without the return of all journalists of independent media at work, without intimidation and political control of their work, it's unlikely that the information in Burundi, especially during the next election, will meet the criteria of impartiality, balance, accuracy. So it's to fear that it will be a sham information prone to intox and propaganda.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting. Thierry, I was wondering if you could tell us about the international community's role in this. How can they monitor the elections, and how have they been commenting on it? And while we may favor the African Union or regional body of force getting involved, what are the risks of these countries acting in their own self-interest and worsening the current crisis? For example, I'm thinking of Rwanda. What is Paul Kagame, for example, thinking about this?
Well, nobody is going to monitor those elections because the electoral mission that were announced have been cancelled for the moment. The European Union had just withdrawn its electoral observation mission, and the African Union also announced that they won't send anyone. So there's not going to be any monitoring, international monitoring of those elections, because that will also give some sort of a legitimacy to those elections. But the African Union is considering put forward the idea to dispatch human rights monitors to Burundi. And this is probably going to be discussed during the next African Union summit in South Africa. Of course, they need the agreement of the Burundian government. So we still have to see if this is going to happen. Because sending, of course, human rights monitors instead of sending electoral monitors has a very different political meaning. Therefore, it's for the moment there is the last forum to discuss those elections is the African Union summit, but there is not much hope that they will manage to influence very much the Nkurunziza government at this stage. The African Union is also said that they are doing some contingency planning in consultation with the East African community. This is, of course, in the view, in the perspective that the political crisis will escalate and will turn into a humanitarian crisis, and therefore some sort of humanitarian intervention would be necessary in Burundi. We are not yet at this stage. Of course, and all the diplomat. All this also needs some sort of approval by the Burundian authorities, and given the fact that they've been very determined, despite the international pressure since the beginning of the electoral process, the likelihood of Pierre Nkurunziza government to accept some form of intervention in Burundi is very thin at this stage. When it comes to the countries of the region, it's I mean, Burundi, Tanzania and Rwanda have been quite outspoken, but you can also notice that the tone over the last say 2 months is actually less outspoken now. I think there was a lot of dissatisfaction in Kigali about the last East African summit and the idea of simply delaying the electoral process. But at the same time, it's very difficult for Rwanda to be more assertive at this stage.
Yeah. Well, especially since perhaps Paul Kagame is himself thinking about running for a third term, no?
No, not really, because he's in a very different position.
Yeah.
He has engineered some so-called popular support for the revision of the constitution, as more than 2 million Rwandans have petitioned the government for this. Yeah. So that puts him in a quite favorable position, and he can argue that actually the people of Rwanda wants him to review the constitution.
Right.
And I think it's interesting, if I might just add a little something.
Please.
That Kagame was was one of the only ones that had really explicitly spoken out against Nkurunziza's third term, but also trying to make the difference that he's representing the people and he's been moving forward the country. Well, this is something, a lot of the peace dividends that the Nkurunziza government has promised have not been materialized in Burundi. And so it's really like the popular vote that would make him able to stand for another term.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I mean, there does seem to be a difference between amending the Constitution and rewriting the Constitution. And I think these sort of going into this, Katrin, I have another question for you based on a similar line. To what degree can we link the current crisis in Burundi to insufficiencies in the Arusha Accord, both that was after the Rwanda genocide and then again in 2005? Was the wording clear enough to sort of limit Nkurunziza's third-term claim? Did it provide efficient mechanisms for multi-party power sharing? I know this is something that you study, so I wanted to get your opinion on it.
Yeah, I don't think that the current crisis main issue, so that means the question of the third term, can be really linked to insufficiencies in the Arusha Accord. I think Arusha is clear. Article 7, paragraph 3 states that no president shall be elected for a term of 5 years, renewable only once. So no one may serve more than 2 presidential terms. So Arusha is very clear. The current government, Nkurunziza government, argues that the current crisis stems, well, they're trying to take advantage of an ambiguity between the Arusha Accord and the Constitution, and they tried to benefit from an article in the Constitution, Article 96, that states that the President of the Republic is elected by direct universal suffrage for a mandate of 5 years, renewable only one time. And given that he was elected the first time by Parliament, the President argues that he can legally stand again one more time. The opposition, for its part, is really referring to Arusha and Arusha, and says Arusha constitutes the social contract of today's society. And if we try to amend the Arusha spirit, we might also amend other Arusha stipulations, which have become so important to bring peace back to Burundi.
Okay.
But yeah. I think it's also important to highlight that exploiting this ambiguity is now the move that the presidential camp has been taken. They've also tried to amend the Constitution and certain Arusha principles, including a suspected change to amend term limits that dates back to March 2014. But back then, the CNDD-FDD lost this bid by only 1 vote. Right. And then I think your last question is interesting. I'm not a particular expert in power sharing, but I think your question is very interesting. As mentioned before, Burundians really consider the Arusha as the social contract of today's societies that helped to bring back peace to the country. And I think the complex ethnic power sharing that was institutionalized in Arusha has really helped to decrease the silency of ethnicity, something that we've seen in the very multi-ethnic movement of the protesters that we're witnessing today. But power sharing, this power sharing agreement, inter-ethnic power sharing agreement in Arusha, was not able to prevent the continuous authoritarianship that we've witnessed with the ruling party and the instability that we've seen right now in the country. So political power today is really concentrated in the hands of the ruling party. This tendency was exacerbated by a boycott of the 2010 election. And so today, really, the ruling party controls most of Burundi's political life. Many people lament that you have to be a member of the ruling party to be really able to access jobs. So given the changing conflict dynamics and cleavages in Burundi, actually, which have become more political and also intra-ethnic between some of the what used to be Hutu-dominated rebel groups, which have transformed into political parties, there are many scholars and policymakers that have started to ask if Arusha reaches certain limits and ensuring the constitutionalism that it was supposed to protect in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and sort of my understanding of it at this point was that the Arusha Accord was highly successful at sort of creating inter-ethnic power sharing, but then when, as you mentioned, the salience of ethnicity sort of divided and there was more of a political division, it was insufficient in as much to sort of balance those divides and problems. Does that make sense? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to move to a last question, which I'm going to open up to everyone, and maybe we'll start with Marie-Claude. If there is ultimately an inability to hold peaceful elections, either because violence resurfaces or because electoral results are contested, as we know they will be, what might such a situation indicate for the viability of peace-building missions in Central Africa? We know that the Arusha Accord had a massive effect in countries not only in Burundi but in the region. And a lot of these countries emerge from civil war or from conflict. To what extent does the promise for peace building is contingent on Burundi's ability to manage peaceful elections years going forward?
I don't know if I understand well your question.
Please.
You want to know if the election and the Arusha Peace Accord right now are on jeopardy? Is that it?
So I guess my question would be more centered on whether Burundi's inability to consolidate a democracy this round or maybe in subsequent rounds, might that have an effect for other peace-building missions in Central Africa, so neighboring countries?
I would say I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer to that question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thierry, maybe would you like to answer that, or?
Well, the problem is that the peace building policy has not been well supported by the people, by the donors, and by the organizations that were supposed to be doing peace building. It's true that if there is, I mean, Burundi may be the second country after country of the peace building commission that may fall. So that puts into question I would say, the relevance of the peace building policies. I don't think that is going to impact what is done in some other countries, but at least that should force the countries and organizations that, and especially the UN, that are involved in peace building, into rethinking what they're doing. It's pretty clear that this crisis has not started yesterday, and it's pretty obvious that already after the 2010 elections, the people who were supporting peace building programs in Burundi should have spoken out against the repression, the post-electoral repression. They should have actually been much more active in terms of preventive diplomacy, and especially in terms of saying to the Burundian government that there were red lines and there were things that would not be accepted. They haven't done that at this time, and despite the fact that several organizations such as ICG have basically alerted them. We wrote a report in 2012 called Bye Bye Arusha, and basically explaining the root causes of what's going on now. So I think the main problem has been the failure basically to do preventive diplomacy, to be able to connect properly political analysis and programming, or the programming of the peace building activities, and to some extent also the situation right now is due to some sort of over-exaggeration about the Burundi as a success story. There's been a very important narrative, diplomatic narrative, about the fact that Burundi was definitely a success story in terms of peace building, and what we're seeing now is that, of course, this narrative was very exaggerated. So a bit of retrospective analysis is going to be needed by the UN and other stakeholders if they want to avoid what we're seeing now in Burundi, and the fact that authoritarian consolidation is actually very easy despite all the peace investment done by the UN, the African Union, and other organizations. So this is really this crisis is very much food for thought when it comes to peace building.
Okay, and Katrin, did you want to add anything? Do you have something that you wanted to mention? Otherwise, we can move on to another question.
No, thank you.
Okay.
I have something to add, actually.
Yes,
I
please.
think that with what's going on right now in Burundi, they will have to include a much broader perception of what is democracy and what is the place of the election have in peace building, and not just thinking about election as from the date of the campaign till the end of the election, but which democracy is a whole continuing process, including civil society, including journalists, media, including not only political parties, but also people, and that there should be a closer monitoring of what's going on, like longer before the election day and the electoral campaign, because as in 2010, as in 2015, what happened with the Imbonerakure began like a year and a half before the election, and I mean everything was on the ground, everything was to see there, and what's going on right now has to be seen in the 2010 election and before, since 2006, with what happened with the new party, because in 2005 everybody was very hopeful that with a new government, with a new Hutu power, that it will be the end of the ethnic manipulation and political manipulation of ethnicity. And what we have seen throughout all the year is that the situation that we know right now didn't begin 6 months ago. It began in 2006, and then in 2010, everything was placed for what we are seeing right now. So there could have been something to stop that.
Actually, thank you for raising that point. That was actually my question to all of you, because you've all been studying and watching Burundi for quite a while. And I was wondering about the role of civil society. Have you seen it evolve over the years, over the decades, and if so, how? What kind of role do they play in consolidating democracy and perhaps bringing peace to the country and transcending these like supposedly like ethnic divisions? I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I mean, it's the civil society has not been able to transcend the political division. On the contrary, I mean, we were saying previously that the opposition has been weakened after the 2010 elections, but what happened after the 2010 election is that because most of the opposition leaders were out of the country, they've been replaced by civil society leaders. And there's been a very strong politicization of the civil society organizations in Burundi, and that is one of the reasons why right now there is also a complete polarization of the civil society and political spheres. What we call now the opposition or the people who are organizing the street protest in Bujumbura is in fact a coalition of political leaders, civil society organization, and the Catholic Church. And in front of that coalition, you have the ruling party and the president. And that's why there was no domestic mediator in this crisis, and then the UN has to step in. An external mediator has to step in. So the civil society has been completely, I would say, absorbed into the political sphere. Well, it had some obvious disadvantages. Of course, in terms of impartiality, that is a real issue. And in the same way, we must say that the government has considered a civil society organization as political enemies in the same way, and so repression, of course, was directed to some civil society organization, specific ones, to be clear. Interestingly, there was also the emergence of I would say pro-government civil society structures who over the last 2 years have been trying to have been lobbying embassies in Bujumbura and international NGOs to be regarded as partners. So this has created a very difficult landscape, civil society landscape in Burundi, with one side, with civil society being very much politicized, some civil society organization being very artificial because being more or less created by some government people. And right now, it's there is no, I would say, third party in the current political dispute. This is a problem because I don't think the international can, and I don't think it's a good thing when the internationals are the only possible mediator in domestic dispute, basically.
Right.
Would either Katrin or Marie-Claude like to take a stab at the question? Otherwise, we can move on to another one. Or...
I'm fine.
Okay. So I had a question, sort of going off what we were talking about. What sort of happens after this electoral cycle? If we can sort of tell that the elections are not going to be monitored and they're not going to be competitive, in all reality, if this continues and let's say Nkurunziza is successful at gaining a third term, what happens after that? There's many countries are reluctant to step in. I don't know if they ought to step in afterwards. Should this run its course until the next cycle where Nkurunziza would have absolutely no claim to power, even if he tries to find inconsistencies in the constitution? So I guess my question is, what is the next step in terms of what's happening 6 or 12 months down the road? Katrin, maybe if you'd like to.
I think I don't know. For me, it's very, very difficult to be able to look into the future and to make predictions. I think that's very difficult. I think it's still a very big question if these elections will really be able to be held, if protests and repression take off again. I mean, you would say there's. I think the International Crisis Group also came out with a report that had a few interesting scenarios that might be possible in the current crisis. I mean, especially. I mean, the two camps are very camped on their positions, but obviously the best solution would be if they could come up with a peaceful solution to the crisis, which seems very unlikely at the moment. I think another possibility might be that there is another coup d'etat. I mean, the division in the army have come to the forefront during the failed coup. I think there are more and more reports that there are deepening. There have been some reports, alleged reports, that some of the army officers that were implicated in the coup have left and might be starting a rebellion or might team up with other people outside of the country. So I think there's a whole range of scenarios that are possible at the moment, and it's very, very, very difficult to predict how this will play out.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Do you have another question, or?
I'm good with the questions. Does anyone want to add something to this?
Well, I think if if the elections proceed, The way we said before, and the opposition is basically out of the electoral game, it's pretty clear that President Nkurunziza is going to be re-elected, going to win a massive victory, and his party too. And therefore, it would be very interesting to see if there is, after the 2010 election, a post-electoral repression against the coalition of the opposition. I mean, we'll see. Given the are very dissatisfied, and some of them have already announced suspension. We'll see how the economy is doing if this is happening, because Burundi is unfortunately already in a tough economic situation. And of course, what a lot of people are worried about is that given the huge majority of the possible huge majority of the ruling party in the parliament, that will enable President Nkurunziza to resume its project to review the constitution. At the beginning of 2014, the ruling party failed by one vote to amend the constitution. Therefore, it wouldn't be surprising that when they dominate parliament, they will resurrect this project, and this project will, of course, mean the end of the institutionalization of the Arusha Agreement in Burundi. So that's basically our main worries for what comes next after the election. I mean, we also feel that there may be an isolation of Burundi on the regional and international scene, given the position taken by the African Union and other international players.
We actually have one last question from one of our viewers. It's what as think tanks and NGOs in the West, be it us here or the crisis group, and your role, perhaps, for example, Marie-Claude, as a journalist, how do we keep Burundi in our minds today? What should we do to have it in the media and to make sure we don't simply view it as as usual as a small African country where some kind of conflict is going on?
But I think we have to continue talk about it, doing events like you're doing right now. I'm trying. I did a documentary in 2010. I'm trying to make it see as many people, many Burundians that are here right now in Canada, and that were not in the country in 2010, didn't know what happened in their own country. So it's important that we continue to speak out about that, making links with people in Burundi. For my part, I have a lot of Burundian friends who are journalists, who fled the country, who are here or in other countries, or who stayed in Burundi. So to keep in touch with them and try to consolidate the link with them and to share their voice, because right now it's a real problem inside the country right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes, it's very important actually to support the capacity of people to report about what's going on in the country, because there are clear signs that the government is trying to shut down access to some extent. The accreditation of one French media was suspended, and pretty clear that the ruling party would actually like to control the flow of information coming out of Burundi. I think the fact that there are people on the ground who are able to get the message out of get messages out of Burundi through civil society organization is very important. That must be supported if we want to be able still to shed the light on what will happen in Burundi after the elections.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think I
can only. Sorry. Sorry, no, I think I can only echo Marie-Claude and Thierry in what they just said, like, you know, keeping the advocacy going, thinking about different media, op-eds, different ways we can get implicated, organizing events like this. But also there are, like Thierry said, there are still people, I mean, it's in a very, very difficult situation trying to report on Facebook and through social media. I have a few friends that launched a campaign to help raise money to try to support these people so that they can continue to do their work, because they've lost their jobs through the shutdown of the radio station. So maybe there are also indirect ways through these kind of campaigns that we can try to help. Another possibility, I think, is also being or governments, be it here in Canada or in the US or in Europe, to stay tuned and to stay informed about the situation and to not lose their eyes and keep Burundi on the spotlight.
Yeah, we'll make sure to actually raise awareness about that campaign too as well, Katrin. Thank you. Marie-Claude, you had something to say?
Yeah, totally. I agree totally with what Katrin just said. And so supporting media in Burundi is very, very important. Right now, there are two journalists have joined to do on Facebook SOS Media Burundi. You can find them on Twitter too. And there's also a very good media in Burundi, Iwachu journal, that it might need some help too to stay alive. But those are media that right now are still working, and they really need our support, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll make sure to actually rate those points and share those around on our own social media platforms.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we've been an hour at this point. I can see it's sort of getting dark behind Terry in Nairobi, and I'm sure it's the same thing in Burundi. So I won't drag it any longer. I'd like to know how honored we are to have such an esteemed panel with us. And
exactly.
I hope to keep in touch, and we'll definitely work to try and promote this in social media as much as we can. So, thank you.
Thank
you
for joining us, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Merci.
Merci, au revoir.
Au revoir.
Okay. Bye. Bye-bye.